I'm Linda, 32 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until my husband Frank walked out on me for another woman. He claimed Beatrice was everything I could never be: wealthy, sophisticated, successful. Frank laughed as he packed his bags, telling me I'd never amount to anything without him. But what he didn't know was that while he was planning his escape, I was building something that would change everything. That devastating moment when he said I'd never survive became the fuel for my transformation. Before I tell you how I proved him spectacularly wrong, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because this story has twists that will leave you speechless. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Looking back, I realize our marriage had been a beautiful lie wrapped in routine. Frank and I had been together for 8 years, living in our modest 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, we seemed like the perfect couple. Frank worked as a mid-level insurance agent, bringing home a steady but unremarkable paycheck, while I worked part-time at a local craft store called Creative Corner. Our apartment was small but cozy, filled with hand-me-down furniture from both our families. The living room had a worn beige couch that Frank's mother had given us when we first moved in together, and the kitchen table was a wooden piece my grandmother had left me. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we made it work living paycheck to paycheck like so many other couples our age. What Frank never truly understood was my passion for creating jewelry. In our tiny spare room, which we generously called my studio, I had set up a small workspace with basic tools I'd collected over the years. I'd spend hours there after work, losing myself in the delicate process of shaping silver wire, setting small stones, and crafting pieces that felt like tiny works of art to me. Frank's reaction to my hobby had evolved from mild interest to outright dismissal over the years. In the beginning, he'd actually seemed proud when I'd show him a new necklace or bracelet I'd completed. He'd hold it up to the light nod approvingly and tell me how talented I was. But as time went on, those moments became fewer and farther between. I remember one evening particularly clearly. I'd been working on a custom engagement ring for weeks, practicing my stone-setting technique on a small ruby I'd saved up to buy. The piece was intricate, with delicate vine-like details wrapping around the band, and I was incredibly proud of how it turned out. When Frank came home from work that night, I rushed to show him my creation, my hands practically trembling with excitement. Frank barely glanced at the ring before rolling his eyes. "Linda, nobody's going to pay real money for that amateur stuff," he said, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "You're just playing around with expensive materials. It's not like you're a real jeweler or anything." Those words stung more than I wanted to admit. I retreated to my little studio, questioning whether I was fooling myself about my abilities, but something inside me refused to give up. I started selling pieces online for small amounts, usually $20 or $30 each, just to prove to myself that other people might value what I created. Our financial situation wasn't helping matters either. We were constantly juggling bills, deciding whether to pay the electric bill or buy groceries for the week. Frank's insurance job provided stability, but not much more than that, and my part-time wages barely covered gas and my jewelry supplies. I'd started secretly setting aside small amounts from my online sales, dreaming of maybe expanding my little hobby into something more. Frank had begun working later and later, claiming his boss was demanding more from the team. He'd come home after 9 most nights, tired and distant, barely acknowledging my presence as he microwaved leftovers and disappeared into the bedroom to watch television. Our conversations became limited to logistics: who would pick up milk, whether we could afford to go out for dinner on Friday when we needed to schedule the oil change for his car. I started noticing small changes in Frank's appearance and behavior that should have been red flags. He'd suddenly developed an interest in expensive cologne, spending money we didn't have on designer shirts that seemed far too fancy for his office environment. His phone had become permanently attached to his hand, and he'd developed a habit of taking calls in the bathroom. or stepping outside to answer texts. The knot of anxiety in my stomach grew stronger each day, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Frank had never given me reason to doubt his faithfulness before, and I didn't want to be that suspicious, jealous wife who questioned every late night at work. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, and I was terrified to discover what it might be. The night my world shattered completely started like any other. Frank had texted around 6, saying he'd be working late again on a big client proposal. I'd grown accustomed to these messages, so I made myself dinner for one and settled into my studio to work on a new bracelet design. Around 11:30, I heard his key in the lock and the familiar sound of his briefcase hitting the floor by the door. When Frank walked into the bedroom, he seemed different somehow. There was an energy about him that I hadn't seen in months, almost like he was excited about something. But when he looked at me curled up in bed with a jewelry catalog, his expression hardened in a way that made my blood run cold. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I closed the catalog and sat up, my heart already starting to race. "What's wrong?" Frank sat on the edge of the bed, not looking at me, and pulled out his phone. "I think you should see these." He handed me his phone, and I found myself staring at a text conversation between him and someone named Beatrice. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through message after message, each one feeling like a knife being twisted in my chest. The texts painted a picture of a months-long affair with a woman who owned 3 boutique stores in the upscale part of town. But worse than the affair itself were the things Frank had written about me. "She's so small-minded, no ambition, no class," read one message. "All she does is play with those ridiculous little crafts in the spare room like she's some kind of artist." Beatrice's responses were equally cruel. "I can't imagine being satisfied with such a limited life," she'd written. "Those pathetic little crafts she makes probably cost more in materials than she'll ever sell them for." I felt physically sick as I continued reading. Frank had shared intimate details about our financial struggles, our arguments, even private moments I thought were sacred between us. He'd painted me as a burden, someone holding him back from the life he deserved. "How long?" I whispered, still staring at the phone. 6 months, Frank replied, and I could hear relief in his voice, like he was finally free to tell the truth. "Linda, I'm not happy anymore. I haven't been happy for a long time." I looked up at him, this man I'd shared 8 years of my life with, and realized I was looking at a stranger. "So you decided to have an affair instead of talking to me?" Frank stood up and started pacing the small bedroom. "Beatrice showed me what life could be like with someone who actually matters. She's successful, she's cultured, she understands what it means to have real ambitions. You'll never be anything more than a nobody making trinkets in a spare room." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent years supporting Frank's dreams, encouraging him through difficult times at work, believing in our future together. And this was how he saw me, as a nobody making trinkets. "I want a divorce." Frank continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I've already talked to a lawyer. We can split everything 50-50, which won't take long since we don't have much anyway. I want this done quickly and cleanly." I stared at him in shock, unable to process how quickly my entire life was crumbling. "Frank, can't we try counseling? Can't we work through this?" He laughed, actually laughed at my suggestion. "There's nothing to work through, Linda. I've found someone who matches my ambitions, someone who can give me the life I want. You're sweet, but you're not enough. You'll never be enough." That night, I slept alone for the first time in 8 years. Frank had grabbed a suitcase and left to stay at Beatrice's place, leaving me surrounded by the remnants of our shared life. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was drowning in my own confusion and heartbreak. Within a week, Frank had moved out completely, taking most of our shared belongings and leaving me with an empty apartment and a pile of divorce papers. The speed with which he dismantled our life together was breathtaking. 8 years reduced to a few boxes and legal documents. The first few weeks alone were the darkest period of my adult life. I'd wake up each morning expecting to hear Frank's alarm clock, only to be met with silence. The apartment felt enormous and empty without his presence, even though I was discovering I didn't miss him as much as I missed the idea of him. I barely ate during those initial weeks, surviving on crackers and tea, because the thought of preparing actual meals felt overwhelming. My part-time job at Creative Corner became my only anchor to the outside world. But even there, I felt like I was moving through fog, going through the motions, without really being present. The divorce papers sat on my kitchen table for days before I could bring myself to look at them. Frank's lawyer had drawn up a straightforward agreement we'd split our minimal assets, and since we had no children and no significant property, the process would be simple. Frank was even letting me keep the apartment, probably because he knew I couldn't afford anything better anyway. One particularly low evening, about 3 weeks after Frank left, I was going through our old photo albums when I found our wedding pictures. Looking at those images of us smiling and dancing, so confident in our future together, broke something inside me. I started crying and couldn't stop for hours. But it was the next day that everything changed. I was picking up groceries when I ran into Karen, a woman we'd known from Frank's work. She seemed uncomfortable when she saw me, clearly aware of the divorce, but felt obligated to make conversation. "I'm so sorry about everything," Karen said awkwardly. "I just want you to know that not everyone believes what Frank's been saying." "What has he been saying?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Karen hesitated before answering. "He's been telling people that you were hopeless, that you'd probably end up working retail forever, because you don't have any real skills or ambition. He said you were holding him back from success." The grocery store suddenly felt too bright, too loud. I thanked Karen and finished my shopping in a daze, but by the time I got home, something had shifted inside me. The devastating sadness was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a burning determination to prove Frank wrong about everything. That night, I did something I'd never done before. Instead of crying or feeling sorry for myself, I got angry. Really, truly angry. I sat down at my computer and started researching everything I could find about starting a jewelry business. I read articles about pricing strategies, marketing techniques, and business licenses. I watched YouTube videos about advanced jewelry making techniques and studied the websites of successful independent jewelers. I discovered that I'd been drastically undervaluing my work. Pieces I'd been selling for $20 or $30 were similar to items other artisans were selling for hundreds. I learned about precious metals and gemstone certifications, about building a brand identity and developing a signature style. By 3 in the morning, I had filled a notebook with ideas, plans, and dreams that felt bigger and more ambitious than anything I'd ever imagined for myself. For the first time since Frank left, I felt something other than despair. I felt possibility. The next step was finding startup capital, which seemed impossible given my limited resources. But then I remembered my grandmother's vintage engagement ring, a beautiful Art Deco piece she'd left me when she passed away 5 years earlier. It was the only valuable thing I owned, and the thought of selling it felt like betraying her memory. But as I held it up to the light, examining the intricate details and quality craftsmanship, I realized my grandmother would have wanted me to use it to build something meaningful. I took the ring to 3 different appraisers and discovered it was worth far more than I'd imagined. The proceeds from selling it gave me enough capital to invest in professional-grade tools, quality materials, and proper workspace setup. For the first time in my adult life, I had a real budget to work with. I transformed my tiny spare room into a proper studio, installing better lighting and organizing my tools like a real professional. I researched suppliers and established accounts with companies that sold sterling silver gold-filled wire and genuine gemstones. The first time I held a piece of real gold in my hands, I felt like I was crossing a threshold into a completely different version of myself. 6 months after Frank walked out, my life had become unrecognizable. I was working 16-hour days, but unlike the exhausting drudgery of my previous routine, these hours flew by in a creative whirlwind that left me energized rather than depleted. My breakthrough came when I developed a unique wire wrapping technique that created an intricate lace-like pattern around gemstones. The technique required incredible precision and patience, but the results were stunning. Each piece looked like it belonged in a high-end gallery rather than a craft fair. I'd started an Instagram account called Linda's Luxe Jewelry and posted photos of my work every single day. At first, I had maybe 10 followers, mostly people from the craft store where I worked. But slowly, steadily, the numbers grew. I studied other successful jewelry artists' social media strategies, learning about hashtags, lighting, and storytelling. My first major sale came through Instagram, a custom wedding set for a bride in California who'd seen my work online. She wanted something completely unique, incorporating her grandmother's sapphires into a modern setting that honored both tradition and her personal style. I spent 2 weeks creating the perfect pieces, and when I shipped them off for $200, I felt like I'd won the lottery. That sale changed everything because it proved other people would pay real money for my work. Word began spreading through social media, and I started getting inquiries from potential customers across the country. Each custom piece I created led to more referrals, and my waiting list grew longer each week. The physical demands of the work were intense. My hands would ache from the detailed wire work, and I'd often forget to eat lunch because I was so absorbed in perfecting a particular technique. But for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I was building something that was entirely mine, something that reflected my vision and creativity. By month 4, I was making more money from jewelry than from my part-time job at the craft store. The decision to quit and focus entirely on my business was terrifying, but necessary. I'd outgrown my tiny studio space and needed room to expand. My signature style was becoming recognized within the online jewelry community. I specialized in combining vintage elements with modern design, creating pieces that felt both timeless and contemporary. My wire wrapping technique had evolved into something truly distinctive, and other artists were starting to ask me about my methods. The day I hit my first 5-figure month, I stared at my bank account balance for a full 5 minutes, convinced there had been some mistake. But the numbers were real. In 6 months, I'd gone from selling $20 trinkets to running a legitimate luxury jewelry business. I hired my first assistant, Martha, a retired jewelry maker who'd been following my work on social media. Martha was in her 70s, with decades of experience and a grandmother's patience for teaching new techniques. She became not just an employee, but a mentor and friend, someone who believed in my vision as much as I did. Moving the business out of my apartment and into a real studio space felt like a rite of passage. The new location was a converted warehouse space that I shared with several other artists. Having room to spread out to organize my materials properly and to photograph my work in natural light made an enormous difference in both my productivity and the quality of my pieces. I was learning the business side too, accounting, inventory management, customer service, and marketing. Each week brought new challenges and new opportunities to grow. I established relationships with suppliers, negotiated better prices for materials, and even started teaching occasional workshops for other aspiring jewelry makers. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal too. I'd started dressing differently, carrying myself with more confidence, speaking up for my ideas and opinions. Frank had spent years making me feel small and insignificant, but building this business was proving to myself that I was capable of far more than either of us had ever imagined. 18 months after Frank walked out, I was sitting in a real estate agent's office signing papers to purchase a $2.5 million Victorian mansion in Grandview Heights, one of Columbus's most prestigious neighborhoods. The surreal nature of the moment wasn't lost on me. I was paying cash for a house that was worth more than Frank would probably earn in his entire career. The mansion was everything I'd never dared to dream of owning. Built in 1923, it featured 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, original hardwood floors, and detailed crown molding throughout. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet larger than my old apartment's living room, and there was a sunroom that would serve as my new jewelry studio, with natural light streaming in through floor-to-ceiling windows. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the purchase was the location. The house was only 3 blocks from the boutique district where Beatrice owned her stores. I hadn't chosen the neighborhood to spite them, but the irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be living in luxury practically next door to the woman Frank had left me for. My business had exploded beyond anything I could have predicted. A minor television actress had discovered my work through Instagram and posted photos of herself wearing one of my necklaces to a red carpet event. The exposure led to a flood of new orders and inquiries from celebrities, fashion stylists, and wealthy clients who wanted custom pieces. I was now employing 8 people full-time. Martha and I handled the actual jewelry creation, while others managed online sales, customer service, shipping, and business administration. We'd outgrown the shared warehouse space and moved into a beautiful standalone building that housed both the business operations and a small showroom where clients could view pieces in person. Moving day was scheduled for a Saturday in early October. I'd hired professional movers to handle my furniture and artwork, but I wanted to personally oversee the transfer of my most valuable jewelry pieces and equipment. As I stood outside the mansion directing the placement of furniture, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. The contrast between this moment and where I'd been just 18 months earlier was staggering. I was wearing a custom suit I'd had tailored specifically for the occasion, along with several pieces from my own jewelry line. My hair was professionally styled, and I carried myself with the confidence of someone who had built something meaningful from nothing. Around noon, as the movers were carrying in a beautiful antique armoire I'd purchased for the master bedroom, I noticed a familiar car driving slowly down the street. Frank's silver sedan was unmistakable, and I could see 2 figures inside, both staring at the mansion and the moving trucks. The car stopped directly in front of the house, and I watched as Frank's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked like shock. Beatrice was in the passenger seat, and even from a distance, I could see her face had gone pale as she processed what she was seeing. Frank got out of the car first, walking toward me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was almost like he didn't recognize me, this confident woman in an expensive suit directing the placement of obviously valuable furniture into a mansion that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. "Linda," he called out, his voice uncertain. Are you house-sitting for someone?" I turned to face him, calmly taking in his appearance. Frank looked older than I remembered, with stress lines around his eyes and a slightly desperate quality that hadn't been there before. His clothes were the same mid-range brands he'd always worn, and I noticed his car needed a wash. "Oh, hello, Frank," I replied with genuine warmth, but no emotional investment. "No, I'm not house-sitting. This is my new home. I bought it last month." The look on his face was absolutely priceless. Frank stood there in stunned silence for at least 30 seconds, his mouth literally hanging open as he processed my words. Behind him, I could see Beatrice getting out of the car more slowly, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her hands as she approached. "You bought this house?" Frank finally managed to stammer. "Linda, this place has to be worth millions." $2.5 million, actually," I replied casually, turning to direct a mover who was carrying one of my framed photographs. "Careful with that piece, please. It's an original." Beatrice had reached us by now, and I took a moment to really look at her for the first time. She was beautiful in a polished, expensive way, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and clothes that screamed designer labels. But there was something brittle about her appearance, like she was trying too hard to maintain an image that didn't come naturally. "I don't understand," Frank continued, his voice rising slightly. "How could you possibly afford something like this? You were working part-time at a craft store when I left." I smiled genuinely, feeling nothing but peace as I looked at this man who had once made me feel so small. "My jewelry business has been quite successful. I'm actually launching my third collection next month, and we're expanding into international markets." The color drained from Beatrice's face as the implications of my words sank in. "Jewelry business," she repeated faintly. "Yes, those little trinkets Frank used to dismiss have turned out to be quite popular. Last month alone, I sold over $400,000 worth of custom pieces. I have a waiting list that's booked through next summer." Frank looked like he'd been hit by a truck. 400,000 in 1 month. "It was actually a slower month for us," I said, enjoying his shock more than I probably should have. "The holidays are typically much busier. I'm projecting we'll hit 7 figures in total revenue this year." I could see Frank doing the math in his head, realizing that my monthly income now exceeded his annual salary. The look of dawning comprehension on his face was followed quickly by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. "Linda, that's incredible," he said, his voice taking on a tone I recognized from our early dating days when he was trying to charm me. "I always knew you were talented. I always believed in your potential." The audacity of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. "Really? Because I distinctly remember you telling me that nobody would pay real money for my amateur work." Frank's face flushed red. "I was going through a difficult time. I wasn't thinking clearly. Linda, I've realized what a terrible mistake I made. I never stopped loving you." Beatrice stepped forward, then clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Frank, we should go. Linda obviously has a lot to handle with her move." But Frank wasn't ready to leave. Over the next 20 minutes, as I continued supervising the movers, he peppered me with questions about my business, my success, and my life. Each answer seemed to deepen his shock and regret. He learned that several A-list celebrities regularly wore my pieces to red carpet events. He discovered that I'd been featured in 3 major fashion magazines in the past 6 months. Most devastating of all, he found out that I'd paid cash for the mansion with no mortgage or debt of any kind. "I made some mistakes, Linda," Frank said desperately as I directed the placement of a custom chandelier I'd commissioned from a local artist. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime and talk about us." I looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Frank, there is no us. There hasn't been for a long time, even before you left. You made your choice when you decided I wasn't enough for you." "But I was wrong," he insisted. "I can see that now. You're successful, you're wealthy, you're everything I thought I wanted." That statement revealed so much about Frank's character that I almost felt sorry for him. He wasn't apologizing because he'd hurt me or because he'd made a moral mistake. He was trying to come back because I'd become financially valuable. Beatrice was growing increasingly agitated, clearly recognizing that her boyfriend was trying to reconcile with his ex-wife right in front of her. "Frank, we really need to go," she said more firmly. "But I was curious about something. Beatrice, how are your boutiques doing? Frank mentioned you were quite successful." The question hit its mark. Beatrice's expression tightened, and she exchanged a quick glance with Frank before answering. "The retail market has been challenging lately. We're adapting our business model." I'd done some research on Beatrice's stores after Frank left, partly out of curiosity and partly to understand what he'd found so appealing about her. Her 3 boutiques had been struggling even before the pandemic, and recent online reviews suggested she was having trouble keeping quality inventory and maintaining customer service standards. "I'm sure things will turn around," I said diplomatically. The fashion industry can be unpredictable. Frank made several more attempts to extend our conversation, asking about my business model, my expansion plans, and whether I might need a business partner or advisor. Each question felt more desperate than the last, and I realized he was actually trying to position himself as someone who could be useful to my success. Finally, I decided to end the interaction. "Frank, I wish you both well, but I really need to focus on getting settled in. The movers have been here for hours, and I have a client call scheduled for this afternoon." As they walked back to their car, I heard Beatrice hiss something at Frank about embarrassing yourself, but I couldn't make out the full conversation. Frank kept looking back at the mansion and at me, his expression a mixture of regret and desperate calculation. I felt nothing as I watched them drive away. No anger, no satisfaction, no residual hurt. Just a peaceful indifference toward two people who were no longer relevant to my life. 3 weeks after the moving day encounter, Frank began what could only be described as a campaign to re-enter my life. It started with text messages that he claimed were just checking in, but gradually became more frequent and more personal. When I didn't respond to the texts, he started calling, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly desperate with each attempt. "Linda, I know I hurt you, but I think we owe it to ourselves to have an honest conversation. Read one text. I've been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship and what went wrong." Another message was even more transparent. "I've been hearing amazing things about your business from people around town. I always knew you had incredible potential. Maybe I could help you expand even further." I deleted the messages without responding, but Frank's persistence was remarkable. He started showing up at places he knew I might be: the coffee shop, where I'd always liked to work, the art supply store, where I bought materials, even the grocery store near my new house. Each encounter followed the same pattern. He'd act surprised to see me make awkward small talk, and then try to steer the conversation toward our shared past or my business success. Word was getting back to me through mutual acquaintances that Frank had been telling people he was my business advisor and had played a role in my success. The audacity of these claims was breathtaking, but they also revealed how desperately he was trying to associate himself with my achievements. I learned through Karen, the same woman who'd told me about Frank's cruel comments after our divorce, that Beatrice's boutiques were in serious financial trouble. 2 of the 3 stores had closed in recent months, and the remaining location was struggling to stay afloat. The wealthy woman Frank had left me for was apparently not as financially stable as she'd appeared. The situation reached a turning point when I decided to host a grand opening party for both my new home and my expanded business. I'd been planning the event for months as a way to showcase my jewelry collections to potential clients and to celebrate how far I'd come. The guest list included successful business owners, local celebrities, fashion influencers, and several of my highest-profile clients. I sent invitations to everyone who knew Frank and me as a couple, partly because many of these people had become genuine friends over the years, but also because I knew word would get back to Frank and Beatrice. I wasn't being vindictive. I simply felt no need to hide my success from anyone. The party planning process was incredible fun. I hired an elegant catering company that specialized in upscale events, arranged for a string quartet to provide background music, and had professional florists create arrangements that complemented the mansion's vintage architecture. Most importantly, I designed the evening as a showcase for my jewelry, with models wearing pieces from my various collections throughout the night. When the evening arrived, I felt more confident and beautiful than I ever had in my life. I wore a custom black dress I'd had designed specifically for the occasion, paired with a stunning necklace and earring set from my latest collection. The pieces were worth more than Frank's annual salary, but more importantly, they represented the artistic vision I'd spent 2 years developing and refining. Frank and Beatrice arrived about an hour into the party, clearly uncomfortable, but unable to resist seeing my success firsthand. Frank was wearing his best suit which I recognized from our wedding 8 years earlier, while Beatrice had chosen an outfit that was obviously expensive but somehow looked desperate, like she was trying too hard to compete with an event that was beyond her budget range. The guest list was a revelation of how much my life had changed. I was surrounded by artists, entrepreneurs, and creative professionals who appreciated craftsmanship and innovation. Several guests were wearing my jewelry pieces, creating a living gallery of my work throughout the mansion. Frank spent the evening trying to insert himself into conversations, clearly overwhelmed by the caliber of people at the party. I watched him struggle to find common ground with guests who discussed international art markets, sustainable fashion trends, and innovative business models. The most satisfying moment came when I gave a brief speech to my guests, thanking them for supporting my journey and sharing some insights about building a creative business from nothing. The applause was genuine and warm, and I felt surrounded by people who truly valued what I'd accomplished. Frank cornered me during the cocktail hour, his desperation now barely concealed. "Linda, this is incredible. You've built something amazing here. I was thinking maybe we could meet sometime next week to discuss how I might be able to help you take things to the next level." I looked at him calmly, this man who had once made me feel worthless, and realized I felt nothing but mild pity for his obvious desperation. "Frank, I don't need any help taking things to the next level. I'm exactly where I want to be." "But Linda, think about what we could accomplish together. You have the creative vision, and I understand business operations. We were always a good team." The delusion in that statement was staggering. "We were never a team, Frank. You spent 8 years telling me my dreams were worthless and that I'd never amount to anything. I accomplished all of this after you left, not because of anything you contributed." Beatrice appeared at Frank's elbow, then her face tight with embarrassment and anger. "Frank, people are staring. We should leave." But Frank made one last desperate attempt. "Linda, I know I said some terrible things when I left. I was confused and scared about my own failures, but I never stopped believing in you deep down." That was the moment I realized Frank would never understand what he'd actually done to me. He wasn't apologizing for crushing my confidence or for betraying our marriage. He was trying to rewrite history to make himself look better, to convince both of us that he'd somehow always been supportive of my success. "Frank," I said gently but firmly, "you told me I'd never amount to anything. You were wrong about me then, and you're wrong about everything else too. I don't need your belief or your help. I never did." The look on his face told me he finally understood that no amount of charm or desperation would change my mind. Frank and Beatrice left the party shortly afterward, and I felt a profound sense of closure watching them go. The rest of the evening was magical. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my success and who appreciated the journey I'd taken to get there. Several guests placed orders for custom pieces before the night was over, and I felt like I was exactly where I belonged in life. As I stood in my beautiful home after the last guests had departed, surrounded by the remnants of a perfect evening, I realized that Frank's betrayal had been the greatest gift he could have given me. His abandonment had forced me to discover strengths I never knew I possessed and to build a life that exceeded my wildest dreams. My business continued to flourish in ways I'd never imagined possible. We were now shipping internationally with regular orders from clients in Europe, Asia, and Australia. I'd hired 12 full-time employees, creating opportunities for other artists and craftspeople to pursue their passions while building something meaningful together. The financial success was gratifying, but what mattered more was the artistic fulfillment and the sense of purpose I felt every single day. I woke up excited about new design challenges, about pushing the boundaries of what was possible with precious metals and gemstones, about creating pieces that would become family heirlooms for generations. My perspective on relationships had evolved dramatically too. I'd learned to recognize my own worth and to refuse to settle for anyone who didn't appreciate and support my ambitions. The confidence I'd gained through building my business had transformed every aspect of my life. About 6 months after the party, I met Thomas, a gallery owner, who specialized in contemporary art and handcrafted objects. He'd discovered my work through a mutual friend and had asked to feature several pieces in an upcoming exhibition about American artisans. Our first meeting was supposed to be purely professional, but we ended up talking for hours about art creativity and the business of bringing beautiful objects into the world. Thomas was everything Frank had never been: supportive, intellectually, curious, confident enough in his own achievements that he didn't feel threatened by my success. He celebrated my accomplishments genuinely and contributed his own insights about building and sustaining creative businesses. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than desperation or convenience. I often reflected on the lessons I'd learned through the painful process of rebuilding my life. The most important realization was that other people's opinions of my worth had no bearing on my actual capabilities or potential. Frank's cruel dismissal of my dreams said everything about his character and nothing about my abilities. I'd also learned that success wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about proving myself right. The satisfaction I felt wasn't because Frank now regretted leaving me, but because I'd discovered I was capable of far more than either of us had ever imagined. The final encounter with Frank came almost 2 years after the party, when we ran into each other at a coffee shop downtown. He looked significantly older, with deep stress lines and an air of defeat that made me feel genuinely sorry for him. His clothes were cheaper than I remembered, and his car in the parking lot was several years older than the one he'd been driving during our marriage. "Linda," he said, approaching my table hesitantly, "you look wonderful." "Thank you," I replied warmly. "How are you doing, Frank?" He sat down across from me without being invited, and I could see the desperation still lurking beneath his attempt at casual conversation. "Things have been challenging lately. Beatrice and we're not together anymore. Her business failed, and she moved back to Cleveland to live with her sister." I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a mild sadness for two people who'd built their relationship on such shaky foundations. "I'm sorry to hear that. Linda, I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." Frank continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I threw away something real for something that turned out to be completely hollow. I see now how wrong I was about everything." I looked at this man who'd once had the power to make me feel worthless, and I felt nothing but compassion for his obvious pain. "Frank, I forgive you for the things you said and did, but that forgiveness is for my own peace, not because I want to revisit our relationship." "But Linda, couldn't we at least try to be friends? I've learned so much about myself, about what really matters. I could be different this time." I shook my head gently. "Frank, you're still thinking about this wrong. You're not apologizing because you hurt me or because you made a moral mistake. You're trying to come back because my life turned out better than you expected. That's not the foundation for any kind of healthy relationship." He sat in silence for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the truth of what I'd said. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right. I guess I hoped, but you're right." As I prepared to leave, Frank made one final attempt. "Can I ask you something? How did you do it? How did you build all of this from nothing?" I considered his question carefully before answering. I stopped believing that other people's opinions of me were more accurate than my own knowledge of my capabilities. I stopped waiting for permission to pursue my dreams, and I stopped accepting less than I deserved in any area of my life. Frank nodded, but I could see he didn't really understand. He was still looking for a formula, a shortcut, some external factor that could explain my transformation. He couldn't grasp that the change had come from within, from a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and what I believed I deserved. I left that coffee shop feeling completely at peace with my past and excited about my future. Frank was no longer a source of pain or anger. He was simply someone I used to know who'd inadvertently helped me discover my own strength. My life today is everything I never dared to dream it could be. I run a multi-million-dollar business that brings beauty into the world and provides meaningful employment for talented people. I live in a home that reflects my success and my artistic sensibilities. Most importantly, I'm surrounded by people who value me for who I am and who support my continued growth and evolution. The woman who once felt worthless making trinkets in a spare room has become someone who creates heirloom pieces for celebrities and collectors around the world. But the real transformation wasn't financial or professional. It was personal. I learned that my worth was never dependent on Frank's approval or anyone else's validation. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. Frank's betrayal forced me to discover reserves of strength, creativity, and determination I never knew I possessed. His abandonment gave me the freedom to become the person I was always meant to be. I used to think Frank took everything from me when he left. Now I know he gave me everything when he gave me back to myself. And for that unexpected gift, I'll always be grateful. What about you? Have you ever had someone doubt your abilities only to prove them spectacularly wrong? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story inspired you to pursue your own dreams despite what others might think, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about resilience, transformation, and the power of believing in yourself. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see your value. Here's to your own beautiful transformation, whatever form it might take.